Tonight, as darkness settles gently across the continent, we journey backward through centuries of history to discover how entire civilizations thrived without the technologies we consider essential today. We will explore the intricate dwellings that sheltered families across varied landscapes, from the frozen northern territories to the sun-warmed deserts of the Southwest. We will listen to the rhythms of the hunt, understand the seasonal patterns that govern survival, and witness the sacred ceremonies that bound communities together. But before we reveal these practices, we must first understand the geography, the climate, and the quiet intelligence that guided these people's decisions for thousands of years. Long before European contact, the lands we now call North America were home to hundreds of distinct nations, each with specialized knowledge of their environment. These societies developed complex systems of shelter, subsistence, and spirituality, all perfectly adapted to their specific territories. The structures they built, the food systems they created, and the rituals they practiced were not primitive approximations of later technologies. Rather, they were sophisticated solutions developed through generations of observation, experimentation, and accumulated wisdom. As we journey through this history tonight, you will discover that the story of Native American peoples is one of remarkable diversity, ingenuity, and deep connection to the land itself. Let us begin our journey in a region of towering forests and abundant waters, the Pacific Northwest. Picture, if you will, the cool morning mist rising from the Columbia River, carrying with it the scent of cedar and salt water. The air is thick with moisture, and the forest canopy, dense and primordial, stretches endlessly. This region, encompassing what we now call Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and British Columbia, supported some of the most architecturally sophisticated societies north of Mesoamerica. The peoples of this region, including the Tlingit, Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Salish, developed permanent villages despite living primarily by hunting and gathering, a pattern unique in North American prehistory. The secret to their settlement lay in abundance. The Pacific Northwest provided extraordinary natural wealth. Salmon, vast schools of them, migrated upriver each year in predictable cycles. Halibut, herring, and shellfish filled the waters. Seals and sea otters inhabited the coastal zones. The forests produced cedar in astonishing quantity, alongside berries, roots, and game. This ecological abundance allowed people to remain in year-round settlements without agriculture. They could harvest, preserve, and store enough food during seasonal abundance to sustain themselves through winter months. This security created the foundation for architectural innovation. The great cedar plank houses of the Pacific Northwest were engineering marvels. Constructed entirely without metal tools or nails, these structures could reach lengths of 60 feet or more. The construction process began with the careful selection of massive cedar trees, often 200 to 300 years old. Using stone and bone tools, workers would fell these giants through a combination of chopping, fire setting, and patient labor. The massive tree trunk would then be split lengthwise into planks using wooden wedges and the natural grain of the wood as guides. Each plank could be an inch thick or more, incredibly durable and resistant to rot, properties that made cedar invaluable for construction in this wet climate. These planks would be carefully arranged vertically to form walls, supported by massive wooden beams and posts that were themselves carved from entire trees. The roof structure, also created from wooden beams and planks, was designed to shed the copious rainfall of the region. Inside, the houses were typically divided into sections, with the central fire providing warmth and light. Smoke drifted upward through openings in the roof, preserving the fish and meat stored in the rafters while also providing some insulation. Multiple family groups often inhabited a single house, each occupying their own section, though social hierarchy determined the exact allocation of space. The chief's family would occupy the most prestigious location, typically the back of the house, furthest from the entrance. But these houses were far more than functional shelters. They were artistic statements. The wooden posts and beams were often carved with elaborate designs representing the family's lineage, protecting spirits and creatures from the natural world. Killer whales, eagles, ravens, and bears emerged from the wood, rendered in the distinctive style of the region, form-line design, as historians call it, with interlocking curves and dramatic contrasts. The very act of building a house was thus an assertion of status, wealth, and spiritual power. The time invested, the labor marshaled, and the artistic skill displayed in carving made the great house a symbol of prestige within the community. The daily life within these villages followed patterns established by the salmon cycle. From spring through autumn, salmon migration dominated activity. When the fish arrived, the rivers essentially became conduits of protein and oil. Men and women worked in coordinated teams using various capture methods. Fishing weirs, elaborate structures of stakes and woven materials, created channels that funneled salmon into controlled areas where they could be harvested with spears, hooks, or other implements. Some regions used large wooden boxes with one-way entrances, allowing fish to enter but making escape nearly impossible. The harvest was astonishingly productive. A single fishing weir, when salmon were running, could yield hundreds of fish daily. Once caught, the salmon underwent careful processing. The fish would be cut into sections, the head often separated from the body and reserved for separate preparation. The flesh was either smoked, dried, or rendered into oil. Smoking involved suspending split fish over smoldering fires in large structures built specifically for this purpose. The slow heat and smoke preserved the flesh while imparting flavor. Dried salmon, carefully prepared to remove moisture and prevent spoilage, could be stored for months. Salmon oil, rendered from the head and other fatty portions, was a prized commodity that would be stored in cedar boxes or animal bladders. This rich oil provided crucial fat calories through the winter months and was essential for nutrition in this high-latitude environment. The autumn months brought a different focus, the harvest of other resources before winter arrived. Herring and eulachon, small, oily fish, appeared in their seasons, and the processing effort rivaled that of salmon. Root vegetables, particularly springbank clover and Pacific silverweed, were dug from meadows and preserved. Berries were gathered from the forest, salal, huckleberries, and soapberries, and either dried or rendered into dried berry cakes that could last through winter. Nuts were gathered and stored. Seals and sea otters were hunted, their meat providing fresh protein and their hides offering material for clothing and containers. The forests provided cedar bark, which was carefully peeled and prepared for use in clothing baskets and rope. Winter, by contrast, was a season of relative leisure and intensive cultural activity. The food stores accumulated during summer and autumn sustained the population through the months when fresh resources were scarce. This security allowed time for activities beyond simple subsistence. Carving and artistic work intensified. Stories were told, ceremonies were conducted, dances occurred, Young people were trained in the knowledge and skills required for their roles. Trade goods were worked and refined. Winter was also a time of wealth display and social negotiation. The potlatch ceremony, a complex gift-giving event in which a chief or wealthy individual would demonstrate their status through lavish distribution of goods, often occurred during winter months. These events involved the sharing of enormous quantities of food, blankets, and valuable items, with the status of the giver enhanced through the generosity displayed and acknowledged through the crowd's response. Let us now shift our attention southward and westward to a landscape utterly transformed from the wet Pacific forests. Imagine the Southwest, the region we now call Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, with its vast canyons, desert plateaus, and surprising oases. Here, the environment presents radically different challenges and opportunities from the Pacific Northwest. Water is precious. Heat is intense. Yet here, too, sophisticated societies developed, creating some of the most architecturally distinctive settlements in pre-contact North America. The ancestral Puebloans, archaeologists sometimes call them the Anasazi, though many indigenous peoples prefer the term ancestral Puebloans, created settlements that ranged from humble family dwellings to vast, multi-storied complexes housing hundreds of people. The adaptation to the Southwest environment began with careful observation of water. In a region receiving only a few inches of rain annually, every drop mattered. The ancestral Puebloans developed sophisticated systems of water management, check dams, small walls built into arroyos and on slopes, slowed water runoff, and encouraged infiltration into the soil where crops were planted. Terraces were constructed on slopes to capture and retain moisture. Some communities diverted water from distant sources through channels, sometimes running for miles, to bring moisture to fields. They identified the microclimates where water accumulated, seep areas, and natural springs, and built settlements there. They understood which soils retained moisture best, which crops would thrive in different moisture conditions, and how to maximize production through careful landscape manipulation. The architecture in the Southwest reflected both environmental adaptation and evolving social organization. The earliest Puebloan settlements featured pit houses, semi-subterranean structures built partially underground with a roof at or slightly above ground level. A pit house consisted of a shallow excavation, typically round or oval, with wooden posts supporting a roof constructed from branches, mud, and other materials. An entrance was typically accessed via a ramp or ladder. Inside, a central fire provided heat and light. These structures, being partially underground, offered natural insulation, remaining cool in summer and relatively warm in winter by retaining the Earth's stable temperature. The construction was relatively simple and quick, requiring fewer materials than above-ground structures. Over centuries, construction methods evolved. Above-ground adobe structures became dominant. Adobe, bricks made from sun-baked mud mixed with straw and other materials, offered several advantages. The clay-rich soils of the Southwest were ideal for adobe production. The resulting bricks, when properly made and fired by the sun, were durable and thermally massive. Walls built from adobe absorbed heat during the day and released it gradually at night, moderating temperature swings. The thick mud walls provided excellent insulation. Over time, pueblos, the communal buildings that gave this culture its later name, grew increasingly complex. By the height of Chacuan civilization, around 1100 CE, some pueblos reached 5 stories high and contained hundreds of rooms. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico hosted several of these massive settlements, with connections to dozens of satellite communities across the region, linked by carefully engineered roads. The larger pueblos were not simple aggregations of rooms, but carefully planned communities reflecting sophisticated social organization. At Chaco Canyon, the great pueblos like Pueblo Bonito displayed remarkable architectural precision. The central plaza, around which rooms were arranged, served as the heart of community life. Some scholars believe this plaza functioned as a gathering place for ceremonies and meetings. The multiple stories of rooms surrounding the plaza created a defensive perimeter, while also providing space for storage, habitation, and specialized activities. Great kivas, large ceremonial chambers, were excavated into the plaza floor itself, sometimes reaching 40 feet in diameter. These ceremonial spaces, with their formal entrances, benches, and central fire pits, were clearly designed for specific ritual purposes that gathered community members together. The planning and construction of such a complex required enormous labor and coordination. The thousands of tons of rock and adobe needed to be quarried, processed, transported, and assembled. Wooden beams, vigas, had to be logged from distant forests, sometimes from mountain ranges 50 miles away, and transported across desert terrain. The precision of the construction suggests careful planning, perhaps involving measurement systems and geometric knowledge. The builders understood how to create walls that would stand for centuries, how to design roof systems that would shed the rare rains, and how to maximize interior space through careful architectural arrangement. The workforce itself would have numbered in the dozens or hundreds during peak construction phases, suggesting either mobilization of family labor or some form of corvée labor arrangement where community members contributed time. Within these pueblos, daily life revolved around cycles of agricultural labor and ceremonial time. Maize, beans, and squash, the three sisters of southwestern agriculture, formed the foundation of subsistence. These crops were carefully cultivated in specific fields using the water management systems described earlier. The timing of planting, tending, and harvest would have dominated the calendar during growing season. Women likely handled much of the grinding and processing of corn into masa, cornmeal, used in cooking. Storage facilities within the pueblo, some deliberately designed for long-term grain preservation, held enough maize to sustain the population through lean periods and provide seed for the next year's planting. The security of food supply allowed specialization. Some individuals could focus on crafts, trade, ceremony, or governance rather than purely subsistence activities. Pottery, a distinctive feature of Puebloan culture, served both functional and artistic purposes. Clay was collected from specific sources and prepared through careful processing to remove rocks and other impurities. Pots were hand-built using coil techniques rather than wheels, which were absent from the Americas until European contact. A potter would roll clay into coils, stack them, and smooth them together to form vessels. Each pot was shaped for specific purposes: water storage, cooking, serving, or ceremonial use. The surfaces were decorated with painted designs, often featuring geometric patterns or representations of natural phenomena. The colors, black, white, red, and brown, came from natural sources: iron oxides, manganese, plant ash, and clay minerals. Each Pueblo region developed distinctive ceramic styles, allowing archaeologists to trace trade networks and identify which communities produced which types of pottery. The great kivas and ceremonial spaces built into the pueblos speak to the centrality of ritual in Puebloan society. While much of the specific content of these ceremonies is protected knowledge maintained by living pueblos, the archaeological record provides hints about their nature and importance. The elaborate construction, the gathering space, and the careful placement of ceremonial chambers suggests that particular ceremonies occurred at specific times, possibly coordinated with seasonal transitions or astronomical events. Some kivas had carefully oriented entries or windows that aligned with sunrise or sunset at particular times of year, suggesting connections to solar observation and agricultural timing. Dance, according to historical records and ethnographic knowledge from pueblos that maintain these traditions, held profound significance. Ceremonial dances, some lasting for days, brought entire communities together. Dancers wore elaborate regalia, transforming themselves into spiritual entities or representing different aspects of the cosmos. Musicians played instruments, drums made from hollowed logs covered with hide, flutes carved from bone or wood, and rattles made from gourds or turtle shells. The rhythmic patterns, the coordinated movement, and the alteration of consciousness through sustained physical exertion and rhythmic stimulation created powerful communal experiences. These ceremonies were not performances for entertainment, but rather acts of creation and renewal, believed to bring rain, ensure crop success, promote fertility, and maintain cosmic balance. Kachinas, spiritual beings central to Hopi and other Pueblo ceremonial systems, represent another dimension of religious practice. Kachinas embody natural phenomena, ancestral spirits, or abstract concepts. During ceremonial seasons, certain community members would impersonate Kachinas, wearing elaborate masks and costumes, and participate in dances believed to bring their spiritual presence into the community. The creation of Kachina masks and costumes was itself a sacred art form, requiring specific knowledge and careful adherence to traditional designs. Young men underwent initiation ceremonies where they were revealed as the human actors behind the Kachina personas, marking their transition into full community participation and knowledge. The Puebloan approach to spirituality was deeply integrated into daily life and environmental observation. Sacred natural sites, certain mountains, springs, or rock formations, were believed to hold particular spiritual power. Pilgrimages to these sites, made seasonally, connected communities to their landscapes spiritually as well as practically. The use of ritual items, prayer sticks, cornmeal, feathers, in ceremonies and offerings reflected beliefs about the relationship between human communities and spiritual forces. The careful timing of ceremonies to agricultural seasons and the integration of weather observation into religious thought demonstrate how practical knowledge and spiritual belief were inseparable in Puebloan worldview. Our journey continues across the continent toward the Great Plains, a landscape that presents yet another set of environmental challenges and opportunities. Picture the vast grasslands stretching from the Rocky Mountains eastward to the Mississippi River, from the northern prairies of what is now Canada southward to Texas. The Great Plains are characterized by shortgrass prairie in the west, transitioning to taller grasses eastward. Rainfall increases from west to east. The dominant large animal across this landscape was the bison, buffalo, which existed in herds numbering in the tens of millions. These massive herds provided the ecological foundation for human societies adapted to plains life. The peoples of the Great Plains, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Sioux, and many others, developed sophisticated hunting cultures centered on bison. While agriculture was practiced by some plains groups, the primary subsistence strategy revolved around the hunt. The bison provided not just meat, but also hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and weapons, sinew for cordage, intestines for storage containers, and hooves for glue. The dung of bison provided fuel in a landscape with few trees. The relationship between plains peoples and bison was so complete that the animal appeared as a central figure in spiritual and cultural expression. Bison represented abundance, strength, and the connection between human and animal worlds. The traditional hunting methods of plains peoples had evolved over millennia. The buffalo jump, or piskun as the Blackfoot called it, was a sophisticated hunting technique that involved driving herds of bison over steep cliffs or into deeply eroded gullies where they would be injured or killed. The location of these jumps was often chosen carefully on migration routes where bison naturally moved. Hunters, often numbering in the dozens, would coordinate to move ahead of the herd, using subtle tactics to direct the animals toward the cliff. The animals, especially when frightened or stampeding, would plunge over the edge, often from heights that would kill or severely injure them. At the base of the jump, the injured and dead bison would be carefully processed, flesh butchered, hides removed, bones utilized. A successful jump could yield dozens or even hundreds of animals, providing the meat and materials for a camp to sustain itself for months. Before the introduction of horses, an animal the Spanish brought to North America, and which gradually diffused northward through trade and raiding, hunting methods relied on coordinated human effort and deep knowledge of animal behavior. Runners, specialized hunters known for their speed and endurance, would pursue individual bison across the prairie. Using bows and arrows, hunters would strike vital organs, bringing down prey that would later be retrieved. Communal hunts brought together multiple family groups or entire bands, suggesting that hunting was not just an economic activity, but a social event that reinforced community bonds and demonstrated hunting prowess. The distribution of meat from the hunt was typically governed by custom and kinship relationships, with different parts assigned to different families or individuals. The peoples of the Great Plains lived in portable dwellings designed for a mobile lifestyle. The tepee, or teepee, was the iconic shelter of the plains, though other structures like earth lodges and windbreaks were also used in different regions and seasons. A teepee was a remarkable feat of engineering, using principles that allowed for rapid construction and breakdown. The basic structure consisted of a frame of wooden poles, typically made from lodgepole pine, arranged in a conical formation. The number of poles varied by region and season, ranging from about 13 to 25. These poles would be lashed together near the apex and spread at the base to create a stable structure. The covering of the teepee was traditionally made from sewn bison hides. The hides were carefully tanned using brains and other organic materials, creating leather that was supple yet durable. Multiple hides, often a dozen or more for a large teepee, were cut and sewn together using sinew thread and bone needles to create a large cover. This cover was then wrapped around the pole frame, secured with wooden pins or sinew cordage. The covering allowed smoke to escape through an opening at the apex where the poles crossed, and this smoke hole could be adjusted by moving flaps made from additional hide. The base of the teepee was often surrounded with stone or earth to prevent wind from entering underneath, providing additional insulation in colder seasons. The interior of a teepee was organized with remarkable efficiency. The fire pit, central to the dwelling, provided warmth and light. The arrangement of bedding, storage items, and living areas reflected the social organization of the family group inhabiting the teepee. Typically, the honored position, opposite the door, was reserved for the most senior or respected individual, often an elder or the family leader. Cooking implements, food storage, tools, and clothing were arranged around the walls. The interior could be decorated with painted designs or hanging ornaments. The teepee could be heated efficiently during winter through careful fire management, and the design allowed for air circulation that prevented excessive smokiness in summer. The portable nature of the teepee made it ideal for peoples who followed the seasonal migration of bison. The seasonal round of plains people centered on bison movement. During certain seasons, herds would congregate, allowing large communal hunts that would bring together multiple bands. At these gathering times, multiple teepees would be arranged in camp circles, creating temporary communities that could number in the hundreds. These camps provided opportunities for marriage arrangements between bands, trade in specialized goods, ceremonies, and social gatherings. The specific seasonal timing of these gatherings varied by region and likely reflected the historical evolution of particular nations and their relationships with each other. As seasons changed and bison moved, the camps would break apart, with family groups or smaller bands dispersing to follow the animals or exploit other seasonal resources like berries or fish. The material culture of plains peoples reflected both practical considerations and aesthetic sensibilities. Clothing was crafted from bison and other animal hides, with garments tailored to provide warmth in winter and protection from sun and elements in summer. Buffalo hide was worked into robes that could serve as blankets, clothing, or display pieces. Some robes were painted with geometric or representational designs. The production of such garments required specialized knowledge of hide tanning, cutting, and sewing. Quill work, the use of porcupine quills as decoration, represented another art form of great cultural significance. These quills, dyed in various colors using plant-based dyes, were sewn onto clothing, bags, and other items in intricate patterns. The tedious work required remarkable patience and skill. Weapons and tools were crafted with attention to both function and form. Bows were carefully constructed from wood, horn, and sinew, with designs refined over generations to achieve maximum power and accuracy. Arrows were fletched with feathers, often selected from eagles or other birds of particular significance. The arrowheads, chipped from stone, were shaped to specific forms for different purposes: hunting large game, hunting birds, or warfare. Spears and lances served similar purposes, with considerable variation in design reflecting both functional specialization and regional traditions. Shields, used in warfare, were crafted from layered hide stretched over wooden frames and often featured painted designs believed to provide spiritual protection. The everyday tools of plains life, scrapers for hide preparation, knives for butchering, awls for sewing, containers for storage, were crafted from bone, stone, or wood with remarkable efficiency. Hide preparation itself required specialized knowledge and tools. The fresh hide would be staked out and scraped, first with a stone or bone scraper to remove hair and tissue, then worked and softened through tanning processes. The completed leather would be flexible and suitable for clothing or container purposes. The production of these practical items often involved aesthetic consideration. Even utilitarian tools might be decorated with carved designs, wrapped with colored cordage, or inlaid with quill or bead. portable art objects created from stone, bone, or antler demonstrate the creative traditions of Plains peoples. Carved figurines, decorated containers, and worked ornaments suggest that artistic expression was valued even in a mobile lifestyle. The constraints of portability would have encouraged the creation of smaller artworks rather than monumental sculpture or large-scale architectural decoration. Though rock art, petroglyphs, and pictographs provides evidence that such artistic traditions also existed. The careful repetition of particular motifs across multiple objects and regions suggests the transmission of aesthetic values and perhaps shared spiritual or cultural meanings. The spiritual and ceremonial life of Plains peoples incorporated elements reflecting their environment and worldview. The sun dance, a major ceremony conducted across numerous Plains nations, with variations reflecting local traditions, represented a central religious event. The ceremony, conducted in summer when multiple bands gathered, involved days of dancing, fasting, and self-sacrifice. The construction of a special lodge to house the ceremony required specific knowledge and proper procedures. At the center stood a sacred tree, carefully selected and prepared. Through the ceremony, participants sought visions, healing, renewal, and connection to spiritual forces believed to sustain the people and ensure the continuation of the buffalo. The vision quest represented another crucial spiritual practice. Young men, and sometimes women, would seek sacred knowledge and power through solitude, fasting, and prayer. An individual would travel to a remote location and remain there for several days without food or water, opening themselves to spiritual communication. These visions, often involving encounters with animals, spirits, or ancestors, were believed to convey personal power, protective spirits, or guidance for future life. The knowledge gained through vision quests was personal and sacred, though the general practice was widely known and culturally valued as a passage into adult religious knowledge. The sweat lodge, a structure used for purification and healing ceremonies, was constructed temporarily and used regularly in many Plains communities. These small, domed structures, typically made from bent branches covered with hide, would heat stones to high temperatures. Water poured on the hot stones would create intense steam within the enclosed space. The occupants would remain in the steam until the heat became unbearable, then emerge into the cooler air, repeating the process through multiple rounds. The ritual was believed to purify the body and spirit, promote healing, and open individuals to spiritual communication. Trade networks connected Plains peoples to distant regions, facilitating the exchange of specialized goods and fostering cultural interaction. Shells from the Pacific coast and Atlantic coast, obsidian from volcanic regions, pipestone from Minnesota, and other exotic materials found their way into Plains communities, often transformed into prestige items or ceremonial objects. This trade was not simply economic exchange, but involved social relationships, reciprocal obligations, and cultural communication. Items received in trade were often incorporated into the recipient's spiritual or personal regalia, becoming symbols of connection to distant peoples and sacred forces. Let us now travel eastward through the continent, leaving the grasslands behind and entering the vast forests that once blanketed the eastern regions of North America. The eastern woodlands, encompassing the Great Lakes region, the Atlantic coast, the Mississippi River Valley, and the southeastern United States, presented yet another distinct environment and supported the development of distinct cultural patterns. In this region of abundant forests, rivers, and temperate climate, societies developed that combined hunting and gathering with agriculture, creating semi-sedentary or sedentary communities, quite different from the fully mobile plains cultures. The forests of the eastern woodlands contained extraordinary diversity of resources. Hardwood trees, oak, hickory, chestnut, maple, and countless others provided nuts, seeds, bark, and wood. Understory plants produced berries, roots, and medicinal substances. Rivers and streams were rich with fish. Deer, elk, and other large game moved through the forests. The seasonal diversity meant that different resources peaked at different times. Spring provided fish runs, early summer brought fresh vegetation. Summer and fall yielded berries and nuts, and winter sometimes offered controlled hunting opportunities. The peoples of this region, including the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, the Algonquian-speaking nations, the Mississippian-influenced southeastern peoples, and many others, learned to harvest these seasonal resources systematically and store them for lean periods. Agriculture, likely diffusing northward and eastward from Mesoamerica, became increasingly important in the eastern woodlands over the centuries preceding European contact. Maize, beans, and squash, the same three crops cultivated in the Southwest, were adopted and adapted to the more temperate climate of the eastern woodlands. Fields were created through clearing the forest, often through a combination of girdling trees and burning. The cleared areas, enriched with ash and cleared of competing vegetation, yielded excellent crops. These fields were not permanent in the sense of decades or centuries. As soil productivity declined after several years of cultivation, a process called soil depletion, communities might shift to new fields elsewhere in their territory, allowing the old fields to regenerate and eventually return to forest. This shifting cultivation system required sufficient land and low enough population density to be sustainable, conditions that generally held in the eastern woodlands before European contact. The combination of agriculture and hunting-gathering created a mixed subsistence economy with considerable security. Agricultural production provided reliable starches and proteins, while hunting and gathering contributed supplementary foods and materials. The storage of corn in special structures ensured that the population could survive winter or recover from poor harvests. This security allowed larger, more stable populations than would have been possible on hunting-gathering alone. The ability to accumulate surplus goods through agricultural production created the foundation for more complex social organization, craft specialization, and trade networks. The peoples of the eastern woodlands developed diverse dwelling forms, reflecting regional ecology and cultural tradition. The Haudenosaunee longhouse was one of the most distinctive architectural forms. These structures, built with flexible saplings bent into arches to create the frame and covered with elm or hickory bark, could reach lengths of 200 feet or more. Multiple family units inhabited a single longhouse, each occupying a separate section along the length of the structure. A central corridor ran the length of the longhouse, with hearths spaced periodically for cooking and warmth. Each family section typically had a hearth shared between adjacent families, creating a paired arrangement. Storage areas for food and materials occupied the upper reaches beneath the roof. The longhouse was not simply a dwelling, but the physical manifestation of matrilineal clan organization. Among the Haudenosaunee, property and clan membership passed through the female line. A woman who married would remain in her mother's longhouse, and her husband would move to her residence. The children of the marriage belonged to the mother's clan. Multiple generations of related women, mothers, daughters, granddaughters, and sisters, lived together in the longhouse, creating a residential unit centered on female kinship. The leadership of the household was typically exercised by the senior woman, who held authority over resource allocation and many household decisions. The physical structure of the longhouse thus reflected and reinforced social organization based on female kinship and matrilineal inheritance. Other eastern woodlands peoples constructed dome-shaped or conical structures, wigwams or wickiups, built from flexible saplings bent into an arched frame and covered with bark, hide, or mats. These structures, typically smaller than longhouses and housing single-family units, were suited to peoples who maintained greater residential mobility, moving seasonally to exploit different resources. The flexibility and portability of such structures allowed groups to establish temporary settlements near fishing locations, hunting grounds, or gathering sites. Some groups maintained multiple seasonal camps, a winter village, a spring fishing camp, a summer gathering place, moving according to the seasonal availability of resources. The settlement patterns of eastern woodlands peoples reflected these dwelling forms. The Haudenosaunee and other agricultural societies typically maintained villages as primary settlements, occupied year-round. These villages, sometimes fortified with wooden palisades, contained multiple longhouses, storage structures, and associated facilities. The villages might be relocated every 20 to 50 years as local resources, particularly firewood, became depleted or as soil productivity declined. The migration to a new location involved the intentional abandonment of the old village, which would gradually be reclaimed by the forest. More mobile groups might maintain permanent villages occupied seasonally, with other locations used during different seasons to exploit specific resources. The choice of settlement location reflected deep environmental knowledge, understanding where particular resources could be reliably found, how to gain access to them, and how to organize settlements for efficient harvesting and processing. The maize cultivation systems of the eastern woodlands peoples, adapted from techniques used in more southern regions, developed considerable sophistication. Fields were cleared from the forest through labor-intensive processes. Trees would be girdled, cutting off the flow of sap and causing them to die. Or the undergrowth would be burned in controlled fires that killed small trees, while the heat from soil fires killed seeds and root systems of competing plants. The charred wood and ash enriched the soil with minerals and created excellent conditions for corn cultivation. Seeds were planted in small hills with multiple seeds per location to ensure that germination of at least some seeds would occur. As the plants grew, other crops were interplanted, beans growing up the corn stalks and squash spreading along the ground. This polyculture system, far from being accidental, was deliberate and sophisticated. The beans, through symbiotic relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, enriched the soil for the corn. The squash provided ground coverage that suppressed weeds, retained moisture, and protected the soil from erosion and excessive sun exposure. The labor requirements of agriculture were substantial and followed a distinct seasonal pattern. Field preparation in spring required significant labor investment. Planting, which might occur over several weeks as different sections were prepared, also demanded focused effort. The growing season required periodic weeding and maintenance. Harvest, concentrated into autumn months, required coordinated labor to gather the ripened corn, beans, and squash. The processing of these crops was equally labor-intensive. Corn was dried on racks or in special structures for storage as whole kernels. Some corn was processed into cornmeal or corn flour through grinding on stone mortars. Beans were allowed to dry completely on the plant or in bundles, then stored whole. Squash was cut, dried, or stored whole in cool, dry locations. The storage of these harvest products required specialized facilities, storage pits, raised structures, or interior sections of houses designed to protect food from pests, moisture, and temperature extremes. The cultivation of tobacco holds significance beyond nutrition. Tobacco was cultivated and dried for use in ceremonies and social gatherings. The smoke from tobacco was believed to carry prayers and communications to spiritual realms. The sharing of tobacco, often in a pipe with ceremonial significance, formalized social bonds and initiated important discussions. The growing of tobacco, the careful drying and curing of leaves, and the crafting of pipes were specialized skills that carried cultural and spiritual meaning beyond simple agriculture. Hunting, while supplementary to agriculture, remained culturally and spiritually significant. Deer were the primary target, providing meat, hide for clothing and leather goods, and bone for tools. The hunting of deer involved extensive knowledge of animal behavior and movement patterns. Communal hunts, particularly in fall or winter, would drive deer into enclosed areas or toward hunters. Individual hunting, with bow and arrow or pit traps, also occurred. The meat would be dried or smoked for storage. The hide, carefully removed and tanned through laborious processing, became leather for clothing and containers. Every part of the deer was utilized: bones for tools, sinew for cordage, hooves for glue, stomach for containers. This complete utilization reflected both practical efficiency and a world view that honored the animal's sacrifice. The security provided by agricultural production supported the development of craft specialization. Individuals with particular skills could devote significant time to producing specialized goods rather than focusing entirely on subsistence. Pottery production, though women-centered in many groups, involved careful knowledge of clay sources, preparation techniques, and firing methods. Clay vessels served multiple purposes: storage of dried foods, cooking by direct placement in fires, serving, and ceremonial use. The decorative styles of pottery, impressed patterns, incised designs, or painted imagery, carried cultural meaning and allowed identification of the producing group. The aesthetic traditions, refined over generations, represented significant cultural knowledge embedded in the physical artifacts. Basketry represented another significant craft tradition. Baskets woven from plant materials served multiple purposes: storage, transport, winnowing grain, and carrying goods. The particular plant materials available locally, the techniques for processing them into suitable materials, and the weaving patterns reflected regional traditions and individual skill. Some baskets, particularly those for ceremonial purposes, reached remarkable levels of aesthetic sophistication and technical precision. Metalworking in copper developed in some eastern woodlands regions, particularly around the Great Lakes. Copper, which could be cold worked without smelting, was fashioned into ornaments, bracelets, pendants, and other items of prestige and spiritual significance. The copper was shaped through careful hammering and other techniques, then often etched with designs. The color of copper, its rarity, and its durability made copper items valuable. They appeared in burials and served as gifts in ceremonies. The The distribution of copper items through trade networks suggests their value and the prestige associated with their possession. Bone and antler carving, shell working, and other specialized crafts employed knowledge and skill refined through long practice. These artisans created tools, ornaments, and items of ceremonial significance. The level of precision and the aesthetic consideration visible in these items demonstrates a high level of skill and cultural value placed on quality craftsmanship. The transmission of these skills from parent to apprentice created continuities of tradition across generations. The Eastern Woodland societies ranged in political complexity from autonomous village communities to confederations spanning multiple nations. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, represented a sophisticated political organization uniting 5 and later 6 nations: the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk, and later the Tuscarora. While remaining independent nations, these 5 nations maintained a confederate structure for handling matters of common interest: warfare, diplomacy, and major ceremonial events. The governance structure of these societies involved councils of leaders, typically including both civil chiefs and war leaders. Among many Eastern Woodlands peoples, women held significant authority in political processes. Among the Haudenosaunee, the clan mothers, senior women of each clan, held authority in village affairs and significant influence in selecting representatives to the Confederate Council. Some scholars have suggested that this recognition of female authority influenced later European political thinkers who encountered these societies. Decisions in councils were typically reached through consensus building rather than authoritarian decree, with extensive discussion and negotiation until agreement was achieved. The relationship between communities ranged from trade partnerships to warfare. Trade networks connected Eastern Woodlands peoples to distant regions, facilitating exchange of specialized goods: shells from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and other valued items. Trade relationships often involved gift exchange and mutual obligation, creating bonds between trading partners and their communities. These trade relationships could be formalized through ceremonies and marriage alliances between communities. Warfare was conducted according to culturally established protocols. Raids might be conducted to settle grievances, capture enemies as compensation for lost family members, or acquire prestige and resources. The capture of enemies served specific purposes in some societies. Adoption into the capturing group to replace lost community members, or captive taking that followed particular rules and expectations. The rituals and protocols surrounding warfare suggest that it was not simply random violence but organized according to cultural rules and objectives. In the southeastern regions of North America, influenced by earlier Mississippian civilizations, different settlement and social patterns emerged. While the Mississippian civilization itself centered in the Mississippi River Valley, with populations concentrated in and around Cahokia, had declined by the time of European contact, its influences persisted in the southeastern societies that survived into the historical period. These southeastern peoples, including the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee, maintained complex societies with hierarchical social organization, significant towns as population centers, and ceremonial systems that reflected Mississippian heritage. These societies maintained permanent settlements organized around central plaza areas, reminiscent of Mississippian town plans, but on a smaller scale. Chiefs' houses or council houses occupied prominent positions, and storage structures for communal resources held prominent locations. The plaza served as the location for ceremonies, ball games, and community gatherings. This settlement pattern, with its emphasis on communal space and central authority, differed from the more dispersed settlement patterns of some northern woodland societies. The green corn ceremony, or busk, held profound significance in many southeastern societies. Celebrated at the time of corn ripening, this multi-day ceremony involved fasting, purification, renewal of fire, and forgiveness of debts and transgressions. The ceremony marked the beginning of the new year and the renewed covenant between community members and the spiritual forces that sustained them. Specific individuals undertook rigorous rituals, purifying themselves through fasting and abstinence. The community collectively participated in renewal ceremonies and feasting. The psychological and spiritual renewal provided by this ceremony, conducted in the context of the harvest and the completion of a growing cycle, reinforced community cohesion and spiritual orientation. Across all the eastern woodlands regions, distinctive patterns of personal adornment served to communicate status, clan affiliation, and individual identity. Tattooing and scarification created permanent body modifications carrying cultural meaning. The specific patterns, placement on the body, and the circumstances under which they were undertaken varied by culture, but the practice was widespread. Tattoos might commemorate important events, demonstrate belonging to particular clans, or mark significant life transitions. The process of tattooing, using thorns or sharp implements to pierce the skin and introduce pigments, was undoubtedly painful, and the endurance of this pain carried significance in demonstrating strength or commitment. Clothing conveyed information about status and clan affiliation. The fur wrapping and decoration of clothing in northern regions, the specific colors and materials used, and the items of adornment attached to garments all communicated information to observers within the society. Wampum, belts and strings made from whelk and clam shells, served ceremonial and economic functions. Wampum belts were crafted from shells carefully selected, cut into small tubes, and strung on cordage in specific patterns. Different patterns conveyed different meanings: contracts, agreements, condolences, or records of historic events. The creation and exchange of wampum represented significant economic and ceremonial activity. The value of wampum derived from the labor required to create it, its rarity, and its cultural and ceremonial significance. Let us travel now to the Pacific coast of California, where another distinctive cultural adaptation developed among peoples including the Chumash, the Pomo, the Yurok, and others. The California coast provided access to extraordinary maritime resources. Kelp forests along the rocky shores supported sea otters, harbor seals, and other marine mammals. Fish, particularly the rich runs of sardines and anchovies, were seasonally abundant. Shellfish, clams, mussels, abalone, and sea urchins were accessible along the shores. This marine abundance, combined with the Mediterranean climate that allowed year-round gathering of plant resources, supported some of the highest population densities north of Mesoamerica in pre-contact North America. The Chumash, perhaps the most sophisticated of California maritime cultures, developed specialized techniques for harvesting marine resources. The plank canoe, called a tomol, represented a remarkable achievement in maritime technology. These vessels, typically 20 to 30 feet long, were constructed from wooden planks carefully fitted together and sealed with asphaltum, naturally occurring bitumen. The planks were sewn together using fiber cordage, creating a strong yet flexible hull capable of withstanding open ocean conditions. These canoes, propelled by paddle, allowed access to the Channel Islands off the California coast. The islands held additional resources: soapstone suitable for making bowls and vessels, additional marine resources, and seabird eggs, accessible only by sea. The Chumash harvested soapstone on the islands and traded soapstone bowls to mainland groups, creating exchange networks extending far into the interior. The maritime hunting techniques of the Chumash and neighboring peoples demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of marine ecology. Sea mammals were hunted using harpoons with detachable heads connected to the hunter by rope. The successful hunting of sea lions or seals required not only the physical skill to approach and strike the animal, but also the knowledge of animal behavior, ocean conditions, and the timing necessary for success. Fishing techniques included the use of hooks, nets, and basket-like traps. The seasonality of fish runs was carefully observed and anticipated. The harvest of shellfish, while less prestigious than hunting, was economically significant and provided reliable protein and calories. Inland from the coast, in the valleys and deserts of California, other cultural adaptations emerged. In the interior valleys and among desert peoples, acorns became a crucial resource. Specific oak trees bearing acorns could be reliably found in particular territories. The annual acorn harvest involved gathering the nuts in baskets, transporting them to villages, and processing them through a lengthy procedure of cracking, grinding, and leaching. The leaching process, which removed bitter tannins from acorn flour, involved filtering water through the flour multiple times. The resulting acorn meal, when properly processed, was nutritious and could be stored for months. Many California groups organized much of their seasonal round around the acorn cycle, moving to particular territories during the harvest season, processing the harvest, and storing enough to sustain themselves through seasons when acorns were unavailable. Other plant resources, seeds from various grasses and shrubs, roots, bulbs, and berries, were harvested seasonally. The knowledge of these resources, when they ripened, where they could be reliably found, and how to harvest and process them, represented enormous accumulated environmental knowledge. Special tools were developed for particular harvesting tasks. Baskets of particular shapes and sizes for gathering different materials, grinding stones and mortars for processing seeds and nuts, digging sticks weighted with stones for extracting roots. The craft of basketry in California reached remarkable sophistication. Baskets were woven so tightly they could hold water and be used for cooking by placing hot stones inside them. Different basket forms served different purposes: large baskets for storage, smaller baskets for gathering, tightly woven baskets for watertight purposes, and decorative baskets representing artistic achievement. In Northern California, peoples including the Karuk, Yurok, and Hupa developed sophisticated management of forest and river resources. The use of controlled burning to maintain meadows and suppress forest undergrowth, though sometimes presented by European observers as evidence of wilderness landscape, was actually intentional landscape management. These fires, conducted in specific seasons and with careful control, maintained habitats for game animals, promoted the growth of particular plant species providing food or fiber, and facilitated travel and visibility. The result was a landscape that appeared relatively open and park-like, quite different from the dense forest that would emerge if fire was completely excluded. This active management through burning represented sophisticated ecological knowledge and demonstrated that the transformation of landscape was intentional and purposeful. The rivers of Northern California, particularly the Sacramento and Klamath rivers, provided abundant salmon runs. Fishing technology included weirs that channeled fish into catching areas, fish traps, hooks, and spears. The seasonal abundance of salmon allowed processing and storage through smoking and drying, creating food stores for less abundant seasons. The salmon runs also brought together multiple family groups or communities at particular fishing locations, creating seasonal gathering points and opportunities for social interaction, trade, and ceremony. The redwood forests of Northern California provided more than immediate subsistence resources. The massive redwood trees, while not typically harvested for construction as in the Pacific Northwest, provided bark for baskets and skirts in some groups. The forest provided game, particularly deer, and plant resources. The understanding of forest ecology, which areas were productive for particular resources, how to move efficiently through the terrain, and how to locate resources reliably, was essential knowledge that defined successful inhabitation of this landscape. Our journey now turns to a closer examination of cultural changes and transitions in the Puebloan regions we encountered earlier. The history of the Puebloan peoples across the centuries preceding European contact involved significant changes in settlement patterns, population distribution, and cultural practices. The Great Pueblos of Chaco Canyon reached their peak around 1100 CE, at which point multiple great houses in the region supported substantial populations. The precision of construction, the elaborate roads connecting communities, and the symbols of chiefly power represented a society with significant centralized authority and coordination capability. Yet this apparent zenith was followed by decline. By 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon was being abandoned. The immediate causes remain debated by archaeologists: drought, social upheaval, or a shift in political power. The population dispersed to other regions. The elaborate settlement patterns of the Chaco region were replaced by smaller, more dispersed pueblos. This shift reminds us that even the most sophisticated societies face challenges and transitions. The abandonment of Chaco does not indicate the failure of Puebloan civilization, but rather its adaptation and transformation. Following this transition, settlement became increasingly concentrated in particular river valleys, the Rio Grande Valley particularly, where reliable water and fertile soil supported large populations. Pueblos in these valleys became progressively larger and more densely occupied. Kivas continued to be central to settlement, but their forms and distribution changed over time. The Kachina religion appears to have intensified during this period, with Kachina depictions becoming more prevalent in Kiva murals and on Kivas themselves. The ceremonies associated with Kachinas became increasingly elaborate and central to religious practice. The specific timing and nature of the Kachina religious intensification remains somewhat unclear from archaeological evidence, but the pattern suggests a response to significant social or environmental stress. The elaborate ceremonies, the masking traditions, and the ritualized social participation represented powerful mechanisms for reinforcing community cohesion and spiritual connection during periods of uncertainty. The shift toward riverside villages in the Rio Grande Valley may have reflected the advantages of reliable water during periods of climatic variability. In the Mississippi River Valley, a different cultural trajectory unfolded. The Mississippian civilization, reaching its peak in the period around 1100 CE with Cahokia as its primary center, represented perhaps the most complex pre-contact society north of Mesoamerica. Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, at its height contained possibly 10,000 to 20,000 people living in a nucleated city surrounded by satellite settlements across a wide area. The city was organized around plazas, with pyramidal mounds serving as platforms for important buildings and as monuments to chiefly power. The largest mound, Monk's Mound, rose in 4 stages to a height of over 100 feet. The construction of such a mound required the mobilization of enormous amounts of earth, estimated at over 14 million tons for all the mounds in the site, transported by hand in baskets. The labor required to construct and maintain Monk's Mound and the other mounds at Cahokia suggests a significant surplus population organized under centralized authority. The mound-building projects were clearly monumental expressions of power, similar to pyramids or temples in other complex societies, and served to demonstrate and reinforce the authority of the chiefly elite. The layout of Cahokia suggests a planned community. The Great Plaza, aligned toward cardinal directions and possibly oriented toward astronomical phenomena, was surrounded by a palisade fence. Important structures occupied specific locations. The settlement pattern speaks to an organized society with centralized planning and authority. Yet Cahokia's dominance appears not to have lasted beyond around 1350 CE. The reasons for the decline remain subjects of scholarly debate, with environmental stress, political fragmentation, or cultural shifts among the proposed explanations. The Mississippian civilization was connected through trade networks extending across North America. Shell from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from the Great Lakes, and mica from the Appalachian region all flowed through Cahokia and other Mississippian centers. These exotic materials were crafted into prestige items, elaborate shell gorgets, copper plates, and ornaments that served to signal status and chiefly power. The control of trade in these exotic materials was a source of power for the chiefly elite. The items themselves were sometimes buried with important individuals, accompanying them into the afterlife or marking their status at death. Cahokia's influence extended into surrounding regions through trade, alliance, and cultural emulation. Settlements in the Ohio River Valley, the Tennessee River Valley, and even distant regions adopted aspects of Mississippian material culture and settlement patterns. The expansion of Mississippian influence during the 11th and 12th centuries CE created a cultural sphere extending across much of the eastern half of North America. Yet this expansion was not permanent or inevitable. By the 13th and 14th centuries, local traditions reasserted themselves. The Mississippian centers declined, and regional societies developed along trajectories influenced by but distinct from Mississippian civilization. The patterns of rise and decline observed in Puebloan and Mississippian civilizations remind us that even sophisticated societies are embedded within environmental contexts that they do not fully control. Climatic changes, periods of drought, or unusual precipitation patterns could stress subsistence systems and potentially trigger social upheaval. Archaeological evidence suggests that several crucial transitions in Native American cultural history coincided with periods of climatic stress. The abandonment of Great Plains areas around 1500 CE and the later development of the teepee-centered bison hunting cultures may have reflected long-term climate shifts affecting vegetation patterns and bison populations. The indigenous peoples of North America, through their history, demonstrated remarkable adaptability to environmental changes. When particular regions became less productive or habitable, populations could migrate or adjust their subsistence systems. The adoption of new crops, the development of new hunting or gathering techniques, and the rearrangement of settlement patterns represented ongoing creative responses to changing conditions. The societies that persisted and thrived in the period before European contact were those that had successfully developed sustainable relationships with their particular environments and had sufficient organizational flexibility to adapt when conditions changed. Across the diverse regions and cultures of Native America, spiritual beliefs and cosmologies displayed both remarkable diversity and intriguing similarities. Many societies maintained beliefs in a layered cosmos, an upper world of spirit beings and celestial phenomena, a middle world where humans lived, and a lower world connected to water, earth, and transformative forces. The movement between these worlds was understood as possible through spiritual practice, ritual, or in exceptional circumstances like vision quests or death. Spirits inhabited natural phenomena, animals, plants, weather events, and landscape features, and maintained relationships with human communities. The concept of reciprocity permeated spiritual thought across many societies. Humans existed in relationships of mutual obligation with other beings and the spiritual forces animating the world. Hunting required permission and gratitude toward the animal sacrificing its life. Harvest required recognition of the plant's gift. Rituals and ceremonies maintained these relationships, ensuring continued abundance and spiritual balance. The breaking of these reciprocal relationships through disrespect or improper behavior could result in spiritual imbalance, illness, or other misfortunes. The proper performance of ceremonies and the observance of cultural protocols maintained harmony. Many peoples recognized particular individuals as specialists in spiritual knowledge and practice. These individuals, sometimes called shamans or medicine people, underwent special training or were recognized as possessing particular spiritual gifts. They served as healers, conducted ceremonies, interpreted spiritual phenomena, and maintained ritual knowledge. The training of such specialists might extend over years, involving mentorship, fasting, isolation, and direct spiritual experience. The knowledge held by these individuals, often accumulated through generations, represented crucial cultural resources for maintaining health, spiritual balance, and community welfare. The indigenous peoples of North America spoke languages from many different language families, with linguistic distance often correlating to cultural and ethnic identity. The Algonquian language family, spoken across a vast territory from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, encompassed numerous distinct languages and peoples. The Athabascan language family, centered in the northwestern regions but with speakers extending far into the southwest in groups like the Apache and Navajo, comprised diverse societies sharing linguistic heritage. The Siouan languages, spoken across much of the Great Plains and adjacent regions, connected peoples sharing some cultural similarities, but also maintaining distinct identities. The Uto-Aztecan language family extended from the Great Basin into the southwest and into Mexico. The Iroquoian language family, centered in the northeast, but extending south into the Carolinas, united the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and neighboring peoples. Smaller language families and language isolates, languages unrelated to major families or standing alone, characterized certain regions, reflecting both the diversity of the continent and the long history of linguistic diversification. The presence of so many distinct languages, often changing over short geographic distances, required multilingualism and translation for intergroup communication. Trade, warfare, and social relations all involved communication across linguistic boundaries, requiring specialized knowledge of multiple languages or reliance on multilingual intermediaries. Across North America, ceremonial activities were typically organized around a seasonal calendar reflecting the cycles of subsistence activities and celestial events. The spring, marked by the return of migratory birds and plants, was often celebrated with renewal ceremonies. Summer gathering times, when multiple communities came together, became occasions for major ceremonies and celebrations. Autumn harvest brought Thanksgiving ceremonies and preparation rituals for winter. Winter solstice, marked in many societies with particular ceremonies, celebrated the turning point of the year and the beginning of the sun's return. The timing of ceremonies often reflected astronomical observation. The summer solstice and winter solstice marked important turning points celebrated across many societies. The spring and autumn equinoxes held significance in some traditions. Some archaeological sites appear to have been constructed with careful astronomical alignments, entrances or sightlines oriented toward sunrise or sunset at significant times of year. This astronomical knowledge, embedded in the landscape itself, would have guided the timing of ceremonies and connected human ritual to the movements of celestial bodies. The specific ceremonial activities varied enormously across regions and cultures. Dances, songs, feasts, rituals involving sacred objects, fasting, and other forms of participation created ceremonial experiences that engaged multiple senses and emotions. The psychological and social effects of these ceremonies, the altered consciousness induced by prolonged dancing or fasting, the emotional intensity of collective participation, the integration of individual identity into community identity, contributed to the powerful effects of ceremonial participation. These ceremonies were not merely social events, but profound spiritual and psychological experiences that maintained cultural identity and reinforced community bonds. The persistence of distinct cultures across centuries and millennia required effective mechanisms for transmitting knowledge across generations. Oral tradition, the careful telling and retelling of stories, historical accounts, ceremonial procedures, and practical knowledge, was the primary mode of cultural transmission. Stories served multiple functions: entertainment, moral instruction, historical record, and spiritual teaching. The narratives associated with creation myths explained the origins of the world and human society while embedding practical knowledge about the landscape and proper behavior. Historical narratives recounted significant events and the deeds of ancestors, creating continuity between past and present. The narrative traditions were carefully preserved through specialized knowledge keepers. In many societies, particular individuals were recognized as repositories of tradition, trained extensively in the telling of important stories and the maintenance of historical knowledge. These storytellers might spend years in training, learning not just the content of stories, but the proper manner of telling, the rhythm, timing, pauses, and emphasis that gave stories their power. The narrative traditions associated with particular individuals or families created personal investment in the transmission of cultural knowledge. Practical knowledge, how to construct buildings, craft tools, grow crops, hunt game, and create art, was transmitted through direct demonstration and apprenticeship. A young person learning a craft would spend years observing and practicing under the guidance of a skilled practitioner. The hands-on learning, the immediate feedback from a teacher, and the gradual development of competence created deep understanding and muscle memory. This mode of learning was particularly suited to skills requiring physical manipulation and judgment developed through practice. The integration of spiritual knowledge with practical knowledge meant that learning a skill often involved spiritual dimensions as well. A young hunter might fast or undergo a vision quest before beginning serious hunting practice, seeking spiritual power and guidance. A crafter might follow particular protocols or avoid certain activities while engaged in their work. The combination of physical technique and spiritual practice reflected a holistic understanding of knowledge and skill as embedded within broader spiritual and cultural contexts. The organization of family and kinship varied significantly across North American societies, reflecting different cultural values and economic systems. In many societies, the division of labor between men and women was quite distinct, though the relative prestige and power associated with male and female roles varied. In hunting societies, hunting was typically the province of men, while gathering, often providing the majority of calories, was typically women's work. In agricultural societies, women often maintained primary responsibility for crop production, while men participated in hunting or warfare. The cultural valuation of these roles differed across societies, with some according significant prestige to male hunting, while others emphasized the economic and spiritual importance of female agricultural production. The kinship systems, the formal categories used to classify relatives and define relationships, were remarkably diverse. Some societies practiced bilateral kinship, recognizing both maternal and paternal relatives equally. Others were matrilineal, tracing descent exclusively through females, or patrilineal, tracing descent through males. These kinship systems had profound implications for property inheritance, residence after marriage, authority within families, and group membership. The matrilineal systems of the Haudenosaunee, where women held significant property rights and daughters remained in their mothers' households after marriage, contrasted sharply with patrilineal systems, where sons inherited from fathers and wives joined their husbands' family households. Marriage practices similarly varied across societies. Some permitted multiple marriages, while others required monogamy. Some allowed divorce under certain circumstances. The payment of bride price or bride service, where a man would provide goods or labor to his wife's family, was practiced in some societies, while others involved exchange of gifts between families or no economic transaction at all. The specific arrangements reflected cultural values regarding the creation of family bonds and the economic dimensions of marriage. The status and roles of elders, particularly elderly women, held significance in many societies. Postmenopausal women often achieved increased status and authority within households and communities. The experience and knowledge of elders made them valuable advisors and teachers. The respect accorded to elders reflected beliefs about wisdom and accumulated knowledge as particularly valuable. The medical knowledge and healing practices of Native American societies reflected long observation and experimentation with plant medicines and other healing techniques. Many societies recognize particular individuals as especially skilled healers who accumulated knowledge about medicinal plants, healing ceremonies, and diagnostic techniques. The pharmacological effectiveness of many traditional remedies has been subsequently verified. Plants traditionally used for particular ailments do indeed contain active compounds affecting the symptoms they treated. Medicinal plants were carefully identified and used according to specific protocols. Willow bark, containing aspirin-like compounds, was used for pain relief and fever. Sage was used for cleansing and spiritual purification. Echinacea, used by Great Plains peoples, contains compounds that stimulate immune function. The preparation of these medicines, whether as teas, salves, poultices, or burned as smoke, reflected both practical considerations about effective delivery and spiritual understanding of the healing process. The combination of physical remedy with spiritual ritual created a holistic healing approach addressing both physical and spiritual dimensions of illness. Surgical procedures appear to have been performed in some societies. Evidence of trepanation, the surgical removal of portions of the skull, appears in some archaeological records, and the survival of individuals bearing marks of such surgery suggests that the procedure sometimes succeeded despite the absence of modern sterilization techniques. The purposes of trepanation remain unclear, whether performed to treat head trauma, relieve pressure from brain swelling, or address spiritual dimensions of illness. The understanding of contagion and disease prevention involved practical knowledge despite the absence of germ theory. The use of quarantine to prevent spread of communicable diseases, the burning of the belongings of deceased individuals to prevent spiritual contamination, and the importance of cleanliness and purification ceremonies all reflected practical understandings of disease transmission. When European diseases arrived, carrying pathogens to which Native American populations lacked immunity, the resulting epidemics devastated populations. Though some of the practices derived from indigenous medical knowledge, quarantine and isolation were appropriate responses to the novel pathogens. The military practices of Native American societies reflected their particular environments and social organizations. In some societies, formal warfare involved organized groups conducting raids against enemies, following established protocols and objectives. The motivations for warfare, revenge for deaths, territorial disputes, capture of resources or prestige, reflected particular cultural values and historical grievances. In some societies, warrior societies held significant cultural prestige, with successful military leadership a path to prominence. In others, the prestige associated with warriors was balanced by values emphasizing peace and consensus decision-making. The technology of warfare reflected available resources and ingenuity. The bow and arrow, the spear, the club, and the shield formed the basic arsenal of most warriors. Some societies developed protective armor, leather or wooden pieces designed to deflect or absorb impacts. The scalp, the taking of a portion of the hair and skin from an opponent's head, served in some societies as a war trophy and symbol of military prowess. The specific practices associated with scalping, who could take scalps, how they should be displayed, what status or compensation they represented, varied by culture and period. The alliances and conflicts between Native American societies shaped the history of the continent. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's role in the beaver trade and their military domination of neighboring regions during the 17th century, for instance, represented a significant historical force. The great nomadic confederacies of the plains, Cheyenne alliances, Sioux confederations, created temporary political units that could field substantial military forces. The historical relationships between societies included periods of cooperation and trade alongside periods of conflict and competition. The remarkable diversity of Native American material culture, the objects made and used by these societies, reflects both practical requirements and aesthetic values. The tools, weapons, clothing, containers, and decorative items surviving in the archaeological record or described in historical documents demonstrate remarkable ingenuity, craftsmanship, and creativity. The use of available materials, stone, bone, wood, hide, plant fibers, and other substances, was optimized through careful selection and expert working to create implements well suited to their purposes. The decorative arts flourished across regions and time periods. Pottery from the Southwest displayed remarkable variety in form and decoration, from utilitarian storage vessels to elaborate ceremonial vessels. The weaving of blankets, baskets, and clothing in various regions produced items combining utility with artistic achievement. The carving of totem poles in the Pacific Northwest, the working of copper into elaborate plates and ornaments in the East, and the creation of elaborate feathered costumes and regalia throughout the continent all demonstrate a commitment to aesthetic achievement despite the labor-intensive subsistence systems upon which these societies depended. The pigments used in art and decoration came from natural sources: iron oxides and other minerals for earth colors, carbon from fire and wood for black, plant extracts, and shell for other colors. The preparation of pigments, the development of reliable techniques for application, and the design traditions that evolved represented accumulated knowledge and aesthetic development. The regional styles in art, the distinctive forms and decoration patterns characteristic of different areas, demonstrate both the autonomy and distinct identity of different peoples and the broader artistic traditions reflecting shared values and influences. The exchange of goods across distances, in some cases hundreds of miles, demonstrates that Native American societies were not isolated, but engaged in regular economic exchange. The shell from Pacific coasts appeared in archaeological sites across the continent. Obsidian from volcanic regions appears far from its sources. Copper worked into ornaments traveled from the Great Lakes region into distant areas. These trading networks, though not involving currency in the modern sense, operated according to established principles of exchange and reciprocity. The trade routes themselves were learned pathways across landscapes, sometimes marked with stone cairns or other indicators. The knowledge of water routes, mountain passes, and safe camping places was specialized knowledge held by traders and merchants. The trading expeditions themselves involved both practical considerations, carrying goods, protecting against theft or attack, and social dimensions, establishing relationships with trading partners, exchanging gifts, and negotiating agreements. Certain locations served as trade centers, where people from different regions gathered to exchange goods. Some scholars have suggested that particular sites held significance as neutral territory, where different groups could meet safely for trading purposes. The organization of trade at such centers might be quite elaborate, with particular goods displayed, prices negotiated, and disputes settled according to established protocols. The prestige goods traded through these systems, shells, copper, obsidian, and other items, served not just as wealth, but as symbols of connection to distant regions and as items of status display. Across North America, certain locations held particular spiritual significance and attracted pilgrims seeking spiritual power, healing, or connection to spiritual forces. These sacred sites included mountains, waterfalls, springs, caves, and other distinctive landscape features. The specific sites recognized as sacred varied by culture and region, but the concept of sacred geography, the recognition that certain places carried particular spiritual significance, was widespread. Pilgrimages to these sites might occur seasonally or in response to individual spiritual needs. The petroglyphs and pictographs created on rock faces throughout the continent may have been associated with these sacred sites and the spiritual practices conducted there. The creation of rock art through the careful pecking of stone, petroglyph, or the painting of pigments on rock, pictograph, involved substantial labor investment. The locations of rock art panels, often in remote areas, suggest they held significance as spiritual practice or historical record rather than as public display. Some rock art panels align with astronomical events, suggesting their connection to astronomical observation and timekeeping. The specific meanings of much rock art remain unclear, though the locations and distribution suggest careful spiritual significance. The trails connecting sacred sites and communities sometimes acquired spiritual significance themselves. The marking of trails with rock cairns or other indicators facilitated travel while also marking spiritual pathways. The journey itself might become a spiritual practice, with particular protocols and beliefs structuring the travel experience. Stories and historical narratives associated with particular routes created a narrative geography that made the landscape itself a repository of cultural knowledge and spiritual significance. The fundamental challenge of living in North America's varied climates, with abundant resources during certain seasons and scarcity during others, required sophisticated storage strategies. The drying of meat and fish, the storing of nuts and seeds, and the burial of root crops underground created larders that sustained populations through lean seasons. The construction of specialized storage facilities, root cellars, elevated structures protected from rodents and moisture, smoke houses for processing meat and fish, represented significant investments in infrastructure. The timing and coordination of harvest and storage activities required intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns. The recognition that particular resources reached peak productivity at predictable times, the understanding of processing requirements that maximized preservation, and the calculation of how much to store to ensure survival through winter all represented crucial practical knowledge. The storage of surplus beyond immediate needs created security that allowed cultural activities beyond subsistence, ceremonies, artistic production, and social gatherings. The seasonal round of many societies involved a pattern of dispersal and aggregation. When particular resources were abundant, salmon runs, berry ripening, or the gathering of nuts, multiple family groups or communities would converge at the location of the resource. The cooperative harvesting and processing of abundant resources was more efficient than individual family efforts would be. The gathering of multiple groups also provided social opportunities for trade, marriage arrangements, ceremony, and cultural exchange. The subsequent dispersal to winter camps or family territories followed as resources were processed and stored for the season ahead. The history of Native American societies involved continuous innovation in response to environmental challenges and opportunities. The development of the bow and arrow, adopted at different times in different regions, represented a significant advancement over earlier spear-throwing technology. The bow allowed projectiles to be delivered with greater force and accuracy, significantly improving hunting efficiency. The development of specialized arrow designs for different purposes, hunting different game, warfare, or fishing, reflected optimization of technology for specific tasks. The development of controlled burning as a landscape management tool represented sophisticated ecological knowledge and innovation. The use of fire to suppress forest undergrowth, maintain meadows, and promote the growth of particular plant species transformed landscapes into more productive systems. The seasonal timing of these burns, the careful control to prevent catastrophic wildfires, and the integration of burning into a broader land management system demonstrated sophisticated environmental knowledge. The development of agricultural techniques adapted particular crops to northern regions where tropical ancestors of these crops could not thrive. The development of corn varieties that matured in short growing seasons, the agricultural techniques suited to northern soils and precipitation patterns, and the storage systems enabling storage of crops through long winters represented adaptive innovations, allowing agriculture to flourish in challenging environments. The development of pottery forms suited to cooking with hot stones, the grinding tools specialized for processing particular plants, and other technological innovations represented ongoing adaptation to local conditions. The remarkable diversity and complexity of Native American societies in the period before European contact, ranging from the elaborate Pueblo settlements to the seasonal gathering aggregations of hunter-gatherers, reflects both environmental diversity and cultural creativity. The persistence of distinct societies over centuries and millennia demonstrates the effectiveness of the cultural adaptations that allowed peoples to thrive in their particular environments. The innovations in subsistence technology, settlement patterns, and social organization represented solutions to the challenges of survival and flourishing in varied environments across a vast continent. The societies encountered by European explorers and colonizers were not static remnants of ancient times, but dynamic, changing systems engaged in ongoing adaptation and development. The interaction between environmental conditions and cultural practices created stability and persistence, but not stagnation. The historical changes observed archaeologically, the rise and fall of civilizations, the migration of peoples, the adoption of new subsistence strategies, demonstrate that these societies were as historically dynamic as any Old World civilizations. The observation of celestial phenomena held significance across many Native American societies. The rising and setting positions of particular stars and planets, the changes in moon phases, and the movements of constellations provided a framework for understanding time and organizing ceremonial activities. Many societies developed sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics, though this knowledge was typically embedded in story and ceremony rather than mathematical formulas. The appearance of particular stars or planets served as signs for undertaking activities, planting crops, conducting hunts, or performing ceremonies. The astronomical orientations observable in architectural remains suggest careful observation of celestial phenomena and incorporation of this knowledge into the built environment. The alignment of Pueblo entries or structures toward sunrise or sunset at significant times of year, the orientation of mounds toward cardinal directions, and the placement of rock art panels in locations with particular astronomical relationships all demonstrate astronomical knowledge. Some scholars have suggested that particular structures served as calendrical devices, with shadows or sunlight illuminating particular locations at significant times of year. The knowledge of constellations, while not identical to European or Near Eastern traditions, reflected careful observation of star patterns and the creation of meaningful narratives linking constellation positions to cultural practices. The appearance of the Pleiades in the evening sky marked important seasonal transitions in many Native American traditions. The North Star served as a reliable reference point in the night sky. The use of stars for navigation was crucial for peoples traveling over water or across landscape without other reliable directional indicators. The history of Native American peoples across centuries was neither a simple progression toward greater complexity nor a regression from former glory. Rather, societies continually adapted to changing environmental conditions, adopted new technologies and practices, and developed new social and political formations. The adoption of agriculture in regions where it was feasible represented a significant transformation of subsistence and settlement patterns. The development of equestrian hunting cultures on the Great Plains, following the adoption of horses from Spanish sources, represented adaptation to new technological possibilities. The development and intensification of particular ceremonial practices appears to reflect responses to social or environmental stress. The elaboration of elaborate winter ceremonies in regions with long, dark winters, the intensification of agricultural ceremonies in regions dependent on reliable rainfall, and the development of elaborate warrior societies in regions prone to conflict, all suggest that ceremonial practices served functions beyond mere tradition. They addressed contemporary concerns and provided psychological and social resources for facing challenges. The integration of trade goods from distant sources into local societies speaks to ongoing interaction and cultural contact. The appearance of shell ornaments in inland archaeological sites, the distribution of obsidian from particular volcanic sources across wide areas, and the documentation of extensive trading networks all demonstrate that isolation was not the norm. The movement of peoples through migration, intermarriage, or conquest created opportunities for cultural diffusion and the adoption of new ideas and practices. As we conclude our extended journey through the histories of Native American peoples, we might reflect on the extraordinary adaptations and achievements these societies developed. From the sophisticated great house settlements of the ancestral Puebloans to the elaborate cedar plank houses of the Pacific Northwest, from the agricultural systems of the eastern woodlands to the specialized maritime hunting of the California coast, the diversity of human innovation across varied environments is remarkable. The development of complex political systems, sophisticated ceremonial practices, elaborate artistic traditions, and specialized knowledge systems demonstrates the capacity for cultural complexity and achievement in societies organized without the particular institutional forms characteristic of European societies. The accumulation of knowledge about the natural environment, which plants were edible or medicinal, which animals inhabited particular regions, what seasonal patterns governed resource availability, represented enormous intellectual achievement. The development of technologies for harvesting and storing resources, for constructing shelter appropriate to diverse climates, and for creating the material goods necessary for living reflected both practical problem-solving and aesthetic creativity. The ceremonial systems, the artistic traditions, and the spiritual beliefs created meaning and provided frameworks for understanding the universe and humanity's place within it. Yet the history of these peoples did not end in the pre-contact period. The arrival of Europeans initiated new chapters involving disruption, disease, conflict, and ultimately colonization. Yet even through these transformations, the descendants of the Native American peoples endured. The cultural practices of indigenous peoples today, drawing on traditions extending back centuries or millennia, represent continuities bridging the ancient world of the pre-contact societies we have explored and the contemporary world. The stories, ceremonies, and knowledge systems preserved and transmitted through generations of indigenous peoples maintain connections to the past while adapting to the present. Throughout this extended journey across the continent and through centuries of history, we have witnessed the remarkable human capacity for adaptation, innovation, and cultural creation. The peoples of North America, through careful observation of their environments, development of sophisticated technologies, and creation of meaningful cultural systems built societies that flourished in diverse environments across a vast continent. The diversity of these societies, the stunning architectural achievements, the elaborate ceremonial systems, the sophisticated subsistence strategies, demonstrates that there was no single path to cultural achievement or civilizational development. The lesson these histories offer is one of human creativity and resilience. When faced with particular environmental conditions, human communities respond with ingenuity, developing technologies and social systems suited to their circumstances. When conditions change, peoples adapt through migration, adoption of new subsistence strategies, or transformation of social organization. The societies we have explored were not perfect or unchanging, but rather dynamic systems engaged in ongoing adaptation and evolution. As night deepens and sleep approaches, we might carry with us a sense of connection to these peoples whose histories stretched back far into the past. Their knowledge of how to live sustainably within particular environments, their understanding of relationships between humans and the natural world, and their creation of meaningful ceremonial and social worlds offer perspectives relevant to contemporary concerns. The civilizations they built were different from those that emerged in Europe or Asia, but difference need not imply inferiority. Rather, it reflects the remarkable diversity of human possibility when peoples adapt to the specific circumstances of their worlds. The stories of these peoples remind us that human history is far richer and more diverse than any single narrative might capture. The achievements of North American peoples across centuries of history deserve recognition not as curiosities or primitive remnants, but as significant expressions of human creativity and adaptation. Civilizations built on deep knowledge and cultural sophistication. Civilizations that shaped their landscapes and created meaning within them. The continuation of indigenous cultures into the present day ensures that these histories remain living traditions rather than merely archaeological record.